Forget everything you think you know about what just happened, because what Iran did in the last few hours is not just a military strike. It is a seismic geopolitical event that has shattered every assumption, every red line, every carefully constructed illusion of deterrence that has governed this region for decades. The Fatah 2, what Iranian state media is now calling the Sigil 2, has struck Jerusalem. Let me say that again so it registers completely. A ballistic missile launched from Iranian soil has impacted Jerusalem. And if you think you understand what that means based on what you've seen in your news feed, I'm telling you right now, you don't. Not even close, because I've spent decades in military intelligence. I've been in the rooms where these weapon systems were analyzed, where threat assessments were written, where policymakers sat pale-faced, staring at maps and hoping moments like this would never arrive. Well, they've arrived. And I'm going to tell you exactly what this means. Not the sanitized version, not the version designed to keep you calm and compliant, the real version, the version that the people in power already know and are desperately hoping you don't figure out for yourself. Let me be clear about something before we go any further. I am not here to generate panic. I am not here to give you hot takes dressed up as analysis. What I am going to give you is the truth, built on a foundation of direct experience with military intelligence, weapons inspection, and geopolitical analysis stretching back over 30 years. Having served as a U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and having spent years on the ground as a United Nations weapons inspector, including in some of the most volatile corners of this very region, I can tell you with absolute certainty that what we are witnessing right now is not a surprise to everyone. There were people who saw this coming. There were analysts, military planners, intelligence professionals who ran this exact scenario and warned about it. And those warnings were ignored, minimized, or buried under the weight of political convenience. That is the first outrage you need to understand. This did not come out of nowhere. This came out of decades of strategic miscalculation, arrogance, and deliberate blindness on the part of Western policymakers who convinced themselves that Iran was a paper tiger that could be indefinitely sanctioned, humiliated, and encircled without consequence. They were wrong. And Jerusalem is now paying the price for that catastrophic miscalculation. Now, let's talk about the weapon itself, because this is where my background becomes directly relevant and where I need you to pay very close attention. The Sigil 2, known in Iranian military nomenclature as the Fatah 2, is a two-stage, solid-fueled hypersonic ballistic missile. I want you to understand what every single one of those words means, because each one of them is significant in ways that most of the commentary you're going to hear in the coming days will completely fail to convey. Two-stage means this missile has a booster phase and a secondary propulsion phase, which dramatically extends its range and makes its terminal trajectory far more complex and difficult to intercept. Solid-fueled means there is no lengthy fueling process required before launch. Liquid-fueled missiles, like much of the older Iranian inventory, require hours of preparation that can be detected by satellite reconnaissance, giving potential adversaries a warning window. Solid-fueled missiles eliminate that window almost entirely. You get minutes of warning, maybe. And hypersonic, let me be very precise here, because this word gets thrown around loosely by people who don't fully understand its implications. Hypersonic in this context refers to terminal velocity exceeding Mach 5, combined with a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that can alter its flight path during descent. That maneuverability is the critical factor. It is what makes existing missile defense architectures, including Israel's layered system, fundamentally challenged in ways they were not designed to handle. Having been in the business of analyzing weapon systems like this, I can tell you that the development timeline for the Fatah 2 represents an extraordinary achievement in Iranian indigenous missile technology. This did not happen overnight. This is the product of sustained investment, international technical exchange, some of it with North Korea, some of it with China, some elements developed through Iran's own scientific establishment, and a national strategic doctrine that prioritized precision, long-range strike capability above almost everything else in the conventional military domain. Iran made a decision, probably 15 to 20 years ago, that it could not match Israel or the United States in terms of conventional force-on-force military power. It could not compete carrier group for carrier group, fighter jet for fighter jet, armored division for armored division. So it built something different. It built a missile force, massive, dispersed, hardened, and increasingly precise, that was specifically designed to hold at risk the things its adversaries value most. And Jerusalem, politically, symbolically, strategically, is at the very top of that list. Make no mistake about it. This was not a random target selection. This was a deliberate, calculated, and deeply symbolic choice. Stay with me here, because what I'm about to explain about the strategic context of this strike is something you will not hear broken down this clearly anywhere else. And it fundamentally changes how you need to think about everything that comes next. To understand why Iran crossed this threshold today, you have to understand the strategic position Iran found itself in over the preceding months. And this requires honesty, the kind of honesty that Western media is structurally incapable of providing, because it would require acknowledging the role that American and Israeli policy played in driving us to this moment. Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful and capable regional proxy, the organization that represented the forward edge of Iran's deterrence architecture in the Levant, has been systematically degraded. The assassination of senior Hezbollah leadership, including figures who had survived decades of Israeli operations, represented a catastrophic blow to the organization's command structure. Hamas, already under relentless military pressure in Gaza, has seen its operational capacity severely diminished. Iranian-backed forces in Syria and Iraq have been repeatedly struck by Israeli air operations, in many cases with tacit American approval, if not direct intelligence support. From Tehran's strategic perspective, the picture looked like this: the outer layers of Iran's deterrence architecture, the forward deployed proxies, the non-state armed groups, the carefully constructed network of allies and partners that Iran had spent decades building precisely to avoid having to use its own military forces directly, were being systematically dismantled, one by one, methodically. And Iran's leadership looked at that picture and reached a conclusion that any serious strategic analyst should have anticipated. If the proxies are gone, if the forward deterrence is gone, then eventually the threat reaches Iranian territory itself. And at that point, Iran faces a choice: act now with the strategic assets it still possesses, or wait until those assets themselves are degraded or destroyed. The Sigil 2 launch was Iran's answer to that question, and it was not an impulsive answer. Nothing about Iranian strategic decision-making is impulsive, whatever the Western media narrative would have you believe. Iranian military and intelligence institutions are sophisticated, experienced, and deeply deliberate. They study history. They study their adversaries. They run scenarios. They wargame outcomes. The decision to launch a direct ballistic missile strike on Jerusalem from Iranian territory would have gone through layers of review, analysis, and authorization at the highest levels of the Iranian state. This was a strategic decision made by people who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were prepared to accept as a consequence. That is what makes it so significant, and that is what makes the next phase of this crisis so extraordinarily dangerous. But if you thought understanding the weapon and understanding Iran's strategic calculus was alarming, then it should be, then what I'm going to tell you about Israel's position is going to hit you even harder. Because Israel is not simply a nation that has just been attacked. Israel is a nation with a very specific, very documented, and very unambiguous strategic doctrine that governs how it responds to existential level threats. And a direct ballistic missile strike on Jerusalem from a state actor almost certainly meets the threshold that triggers that doctrine in its most severe form. The Begin Doctrine, named for former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who ordered the destruction of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981, establishes as a foundational principle of Israeli national security that Israel will not permit any regional adversary to develop or deploy weapon systems capable of posing an existential threat to the Israeli state. Israel has invoked variations of this doctrine multiple times over the decades. It was the basis for the strike on Syria's Al-Kibar nuclear facility in 2007. It has governed Israeli policy toward Iran's nuclear program for years, and it is the framework within which Israeli military planners are almost certainly analyzing their response options right now. The question is not whether Israel responds to a ballistic missile strike on Jerusalem. That question was answered the moment the first missile impacted. The only question that matters right now, is the scale, the scope, and the targets of Israel's response. And those choices carry implications that extend far beyond the Israel-Iran bilateral relationship. They carry implications for every major power on earth, and I will get into exactly what those implications are. But first, you need to understand what Israel's actual military options look like, because most of what you're going to hear discussed in mainstream media commentary will fundamentally misrepresent both the capabilities and the constraints involved. Keep watching, because the next part of this analysis is where the entire architecture of this crisis starts to fully unravel, and where the decisions being made in the next 72 hours will determine whether we are looking at a contained military exchange or the opening act of something that will reshape the entire international order. Israel's military options in response to this strike exist on a spectrum, and understanding that spectrum requires understanding both what Israel is capable of and what Israel is constrained by, politically, logistically, and strategically. At the lower end of that spectrum, you have targeted strikes against the specific missile launch infrastructure that Iran used in this attack, in hitting the launchers, the support facilities, the command nodes associated with the Sigil 2 program. This would be a proportionate, contained, and strategically coherent response. And it is almost certainly the option that the United States is right now strongly encouraging Israel to pursue. Washington will be on the phone with Jerusalem. I can tell you that with absolute certainty. The Americans will be urging restraint, urging proportionality, urging a response that sends a message without triggering a full escalation cycle. And under normal circumstances, Israeli military doctrine is actually quite receptive to that kind of calibrated response. But these are not normal circumstances. Jerusalem has been struck. That is not a normal circumstance in any sense of the word. At the upper end of the spectrum, you have options that I don't think the mainstream media is yet prepared to discuss openly, but that any serious military analyst has to acknowledge are on the table. Strikes against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, strikes against Iranian oil and gas facilities, strikes against the Revolutionary Guards Corps command and control architecture. Any one of these options, let alone a combination of them, would represent an escalation to a level of conflict that the region has not seen since the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And the Iran-Iraq War, for those who need a historical reference point, killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people over 8 years. I am not predicting that outcome. I'm telling you that it is within the range of possibilities that serious planners are currently gaming out. And you deserve to know that. Having spent time in military intelligence, I understand how these escalation dynamics work in practice as opposed to how they're described in theory. The reality is that once direct state-on-state military exchanges begin between two adversaries with the kind of deep unresolved grievances that exist between Israel and Iran, the mechanisms that are supposed to keep conflict limited and controlled come under enormous pressure. Both sides have domestic political constituencies that demand strength. Both sides have military establishments with contingency plans that go far beyond what the initial political authorization contemplated. Both sides have allies and partners whose own interests get pulled into the vortex of the conflict. And both sides are operating in a fog of war environment where intelligence is incomplete, communications are degraded, and decision-making timelines are compressed in ways that make errors, catastrophic errors, far more likely than any war game or theoretical model would suggest. You think you've heard the worst of it? You haven't, not even close. Because layered underneath the Israel-Iran military dynamic is a set of great power dimensions to this crisis that have the potential to transform a regional war into something categorically more dangerous. And that is exactly where we are going next. Let me tell you something about great power competition that most of the analysts you're going to see paraded across your television screens in the coming days fundamentally do not understand because they've never been in the rooms where it actually happens. Great power rivalry is not an abstract concept. It is not a talking point. It is a living, breathing, constantly evolving contest of interests, capabilities, and calculations that operates simultaneously on multiple levels: military, economic, diplomatic, and intelligence, all at once, all the time. And what has just happened in Jerusalem has just injected a massive destabilizing variable into that contest at a moment when the international system was already under more simultaneous stress than at any point since the end of the Second World War. I need you to understand the full architecture of what we are now dealing with, because the Israel-Iran dimension of this crisis, as catastrophic as it is on its own terms, is in some ways the least complicated part of what is now unfolding. The great power dimension, the way this strike reverberates through the relationship between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, is where the truly civilizational stakes of this moment come into focus. Let's start with the United States, because Washington's response to this crisis is going to be the single most consequential variable in determining whether this stays a regional conflict or becomes something far larger. And here is where I have to be blunt in a way that is going to make some people uncomfortable. The United States has spent the better part of the last 3 decades systematically dismantling the diplomatic architecture that might have prevented this moment. Having served in the U.S. military and having watched American foreign policy up close, I can tell you that the decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, in 2018 was not just a diplomatic mistake. It was a strategic catastrophe of the first order. The JCPOA was not perfect. No arms control agreement ever is, but it was functional. It was verifiable. It provided a framework within which Iran's nuclear activities could be monitored, constrained, and managed. And the United States walked away from it unilaterally, contemptuously, and without any serious plan for what would replace it. What replaced it was maximum pressure, sanctions, isolation, rhetorical escalation, and the predictable, inevitable result of treating a major regional power as though it has no legitimate security interests and no capacity to respond to sustained pressure is precisely what we are now watching unfold in real time over Jerusalem. The reality is that American carrier groups have already repositioned in the region. That is not a small thing. Moving a carrier strike group is not a routine administrative decision. It is a deliberate signal to Israel, to Iran, to Russia, to China, to every government on earth that is watching this situation, that the United States is prepared to project military force in connection with what has just happened. The USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, or whichever assets have been repositioned, represents an extraordinary concentration of conventional military power: aircraft capable of striking targets across Iran, cruise missiles, submarine assets operating beneath the surface that no one is talking about publicly, Aegis-equipped surface combatants with ballistic missile defense capabilities. This is not a presence designed purely for deterrent signaling. This is a presence that reflects genuine military contingency planning for direct involvement in a conflict between Israel and Iran. And that contingency planning, I can assure you from direct experience with how these institutions work, has been ongoing for years. The plans exist. The targets have been identified. The strike packages have been developed and refined. The only question is whether political authorization is given to execute them. And that political question, when whether the United States commits itself to direct military involvement in an Israel-Iran war, is the question that will define American foreign policy, American strategic credibility, and in very real terms, American economic stability for a generation. Because make absolutely no mistake about what direct American military involvement in a war with Iran would mean. Iran is not Iraq in 2003. Iran is not Libya. Iran is not any of the military adversaries that American planners have confronted in the post-Cold War era. Iran has a population of nearly 90 million people. It has a military establishment hardened by decades of sanctions, isolation, and preparation for exactly this kind of conflict. It has ballistic missiles, as we have now seen demonstrated in the most dramatic possible fashion, capable of reaching American military installations across the entire Middle East. It has naval assets and anti-ship missile capabilities